So when we took a look at the example I made in Unity, there we go, of this sort of badly composed scene, I pointed out the fact that there is no sort of focal point that we're looking at, nothing to sort of direct our attention. But also, all of these objects are exactly the same, and so none of them really have identity of their own. And it's really hard to sort of parse the scene and understand like how these objects interrelate to each other because they're all sort of identical and kind of in a sort of randomly assorted order. It's not very easy to sort of read this scene and understand kind of how all the objects sort of come together. And so let's talk about how we can organize objects in a scene. So here we are with something similar to what I just showed you in Unity of an unsorted, uniform field of objects. None of these sort of stand out. You might say that this object over here has some identity because it's farther out than the others, but we're really sort of drawing at straws here. These are all kind of the same sort of thing, and there's not really much like static that we were looking at the beginning of this lesson. There's no meaning to sort of glean here. There's no focus on one thing or another. So let's try this. So now we have a bunch of objects throughout here, and each one of them has a very specific identity based on a color. But this is still only slightly better than previous in that there's just so much information here that none of it sort of stands out as specific in meaning. So much identity means that all identity is sort of lost here. Let's try cutting down the colors now. So now we have three different colors: red, green, and blue. And perceptually, you can see how essentially like these four blue blocks, even though they're not next to each other, have a sort of correlation. There's an understanding here that they have a relationship. Same with the red and the green. Now we sort of have three loosely based groups, which we can start to sort of like break down the scene. So it's organized by color. You can group things by size as well. So here, it's a little bit hard to see here, but there's three different sizes of blocks. And so we have small blocks, medium blocks, large blocks. And so now we're sort of like breaking things down, not looking at, let's see how many blocks we have. 4, 8, 12. There's not necessarily 12 things we're looking at. We're looking at three things that are three different categories of things. You can also group by shape, obviously. So here, three different types of shapes here. And so much like with the colors, we're able to sort of associate the triangles with each other, the squares with each other. Group by rotation. Now here we only have two groups. We have groups that, we have blocks that are sort of going left and right, and we have blocks that are turned to the 45-degree angle. But perceptually, we sort of link each to sort of their perceptual group. There's some sort of significance, it feels like, between sort of the characteristic that these have in common. Objects can be closed or grouped by enclosure. So maybe there's fences around these objects. If we're looking sort of a top-down of a number of different buildings, well, now we can see how these objects with the red fence around them are closely related because the enclosure says so. Objects can be grouped by connection. Maybe they have hallways, they're touching each other. That tells us that these are connected to one another. Or maybe they're grouped by proximity. This is a very strong sort of indicator of how objects are related to one another. If they're next to each other, they have to be important to one another. They have to be connected somehow. So even when objects are various in many other characteristics, proximity is such a strong indicator of relatedness that it's going to sort of override those and tell us that these objects are important together. Grouped by hierarchy. We'll get more into this, I think, in the next lesson, but Here we have blocks that are a number of different sizes, of course. But if we are looking at a top-down sort of map of this area, we might sort of start to understand how sort of like these smaller shapes kind of belong to the larger shapes. So this large shape has a medium shape and a small shape, and they sort of belong to this. This one has a medium shape and a small shape, and they're sort of attached to it in here. So we're sort of breaking it down into how do we sort of make sense of the scene by setting up a hierarchy. Grouped by pattern here. So we've got a pattern of objects sort of drawn to an arc like here, or this kind of cross sort of pattern, or this pattern right here. And this is what this does is it separates them into conceptual hierarchy. And by using any of these types of patterns in order to create a hierarchical relationship in the scene, we can create identity that the player can sort of understand. So by essentially teaching the player that these four objects and these four objects and these four objects each have their own grouping, their own identity, we can then within that create separate identity. So this space right here can be its own sort of special thing within the overall whole, because by the hierarchy we understand that first it belongs to this group right here, and then it belongs to itself. And so even though in this overall scene we have two red blocks, so I guess imagine these two rooms are very similar to one another, just the fact that they belong to a different hierarchy means that conceptually it makes sense in the player's mind. The player understands how these objects are different.